Hi everyone, my name is Hansjeet. Today we have a very special guest with us. His name is Dr. Kang. He's working on a project for Sikh Americans. And so let's meet Dr. Kang. Sat Shri Akal, Uncle. How was your day? What has happened? How was your Sunday? Anything exciting today?
Well, it's my day off. Usually I go for a little hike, but today it's raining, so we've watched the farming struggle, different news items and documentaries. So that was the day.
Oh, very nice, Uncle. And recently you took on a project which you're aiming it as a movie as well. And I think you have plans for making it as a book as well. It's on the Sikh Americans. Uncle, tell me about that project first a little, what that project is about. How?
Actually, we have been working on this project for about at least 25 years.
Oh, wow.
So this is basically about the South Asians migration story or their struggles, how they came to US and how they made America their home. Although most of the pioneers were from Punjab and Sikhs, but this is inclusive of all South Asians. And if you go back and look at the history, the pioneers who came from South Asia at that time, India and Pakistan, and it was a one country, going back 120, 130 years ago. So the original pioneers who came to US, especially to California, about 90% of them were from Punjabi background. But we feel like we need to tell our story as Americans. A lot of people know about different other communities because America is a land and country of immigrants. Everybody other than Native Americans, everybody came from somewhere, or somebody's grandfather, somebody's great-grandfather or great-grandmother, so everybody came from some part of the world to US. So it's a similar story of our pioneers. They came here about 130, 135 years ago, and they went through their struggles and their challenges to be Americans. So that story is very powerful. And it's very important that that story is not just told to our next generation, but also told to the average Americans that we have also contributed, worked hard, went through systematic discrimination, all those challenges to fulfill our American dream. So we are also Americans. We also contributed to the development, economic growth, and to the culture, to the music, to all aspects of the American life. So a lot of people don't know. They don't know we've been here that long. A lot of people talk about, oh, Indians came here like 40 years ago or 15 years ago. And a lot of times the story of Punjabi pioneers is not mentioned or ignored. Most of the time they talk about the people who came after 60s. It's a long story. We will explain that immigration happened in like different phases. And because a lot of people don't even know that people from India were not allowed to vote or even become citizens in this country until mid 60s, or they were not even allowed to bring their families. The first time they allowed people from Indian subcontinent to become US citizens was there was a Lucy Seller Act, which was signed in 1946. But that was only limited to people who were already here. So the average people from India were not able to come here legally unless they came through certain special visa or through professional, or they came here illegally and then settled here, so that's a very long story. I can go over that. So those stories are very important for next generations to know that this country was not built in one day, and our contributions to this country are immense.
I've seen your research on this project that you have been working for a long time now. So tell me, it was a very comprehensive research that you did. How was that process? How was the process of collecting the stories, the historical photographs, and the data?
So I would say my inspiration came from the book written by Professor Bruce Labreck. He was the professor and the head of anthropology and history at University of Pacifica, Stockton. So he came to Yuba City, I believe in early 70s, He stayed here and wrote his PhD thesis. His thesis were primarily focused on the Sikh migration to USA. So that book is very comprehensive and very detailed, which is written almost 50 years ago. And then there was another gentleman named Tejinder Singh Sivia, also popularly known as Ted Sivia. He was a librarian at UC Davis, and he also started collecting a lot of original stories of the pioneers. So they were, both those things were very inspiring to me. And then I think in 1996, I was asked by one of the newspapers to write article about Baisakhi, but I decided to write article about the migration. And there are books written by some Canadian scholars. If you go back, the original pioneers came both to US and Canada. Their stories were very similar. When the Ghadar Party was formed, it was like the border was very porous if you go back to 1905, 1906. So all those books and literature was the foundation. Then I will say there's a lot of information available at UC Berkeley. Berkeley, if you look at UC Berkeley's relationship with our community goes back a long time. So they have a lot of archives and a lot of information there. And then we felt that we need to build a museum exhibit so people can come and visit from schools, colleges, and other Americans can come and learn. So we started working on a museum exhibit in Yuba City. And the local museum here, the local Sutter County Museum gave us a little space. So we hired a gentleman who's an expert in museum development. We hired him as a part of our Punjabi American Heritage Society project. So, and then we also have a committee of 5 people within Punjabi American Heritage Society. I think I can mention their names also. They went home to some of the people in this community and were able to collect old pictures, old stories. So it was a teamwork. A lot of people helped us. The community was very generous, giving us funds to develop the exhibit. And then we also recruited a writer. Her name is Leah Terhune. She's a former CNN correspondent from India. She also was the editor of a magazine called Span, which is published from US Embassy in India. So she wanted to write article about Sikh community. She came to Yuba City, and then we said, what about writing a more detailed book? So we hired her as this project. And she has written a beautiful book. This book is not published yet. It's a work in progress. We're hoping it should be out soon. So there are multi-layers to the project going forward.
The Sikh history in America goes back to 130 years, 150 years. So how did you get the factual information? Because I know, like, as our community in those days, they were not very good at keeping the records or keeping data. So how did you collect that factual information?
So I think going back to some of the families, although they may not have published articles or books, but some of those families have been living in this country for a long time, and you go talk to their families. And we started, if you go back, we started a long time ago. So the people have verbal stories, they can oral stories, they can tell, oh, my grandfather came, and this is the story, or this is his picture, this is his passport. So I mean, you will be surprised that there's so many hidden treasures in people's homes. They never felt they were really important. When you say, oh, show me this passport, 1930, 1920, or you ask who came from your family. Also, like we have a gentleman in Yuba City, his name is Kulwant Jol. His grandfather came to Yuba City in 1907. Originally came in 1906. There were a lot of Punjabis or Sikhs in Bellingham. There's a city on border of USA and Canada. Bellingham is in Washington State. And people were kicked out, it's well documented. They're usually, in the history, it's reported as anti-Hindu riots. By Hindu, they meant people from Hindustan, not in a religious way, more like everybody was called, from India was called Hindustan or Hindustani at that time. So there were riots against our people, and there were many people who moved to Yuba City and some moved to Canada. So we had like 5 girls which came from that incident, and their kids and great grandkids live in this town, and they can interestingly can tell you the whole story, what happened to their grandfathers or families. So it takes effort, you know. You have to go to people. I mean, I had an opportunity to interview a lady. I don't know if you heard the name. Her name was Kartar Kaur Tillon. She was born in 1913, I believe. And her father came to USA in 1889. And then he went back and came back again and brought his wife in 1899. And that story is well documented in San Francisco Chronicle. So I talked to Kartar Kaur for an hour. I have a video interview of her, and I have some small clips in the interview. I gave it to you guys for the presentation. So she can tell you the whole detailed story and the journey of her family. The way I met her was very interesting. There was a documentary produced by a lady named Erica Surat Anderson. She was a professor in UCLA. The name of the movie is Turbans. So that documentary was shown by PBS, Public Broadcasting Corporation. So we thought that documentary needs to be shown at our Punjabi American Festival. So we invited Erica to come to our festival. So when we spoke to Erica, she said, "Oh, no. You should invite my grandmother. All this documentary is based on her memoir. She was used to write her diary. So she gave me her number and address. So we invited Kartar Kaur to Yuba City. And it was amazing to meet her, the lady with such a strong willpower and determination. Then she invited me to visit her home. I visited her home in Oakland and talked to her and did like almost an hour interview. So it's amazing that there are so many stories which still needs to be collected and saved. But our stories are very interesting and powerful stories.
That's very nice when you say it's hard work going from book to book, interview to interview, meeting someone to collect all the factual data and their story. So we really commend you, Uncle, on that for doing that and preserving the history. And I have seen the interview that you did with Kartar Kaur Tillon. I've seen that whole interview. I've seen the whole interaction and even the parts that was used in the presentation as well. So we really thank you for that. And since you mentioned many trailblazers, I know you have not just Kartar Kaur Tillon, you have interviewed many other trailblazers and elders in our community to gather the oral histories of their families, because nothing was ever written, no book was there. So it was all passed down from family to family, generation to generation. So how was that process like, interviewing all the trailblazers in the Sikh community in America?
You know, I would say that you will be surprised that there's so much information is available. All it needs is to go and talk to people. I mean, we met son of Bhagat Singh Thind, which is like a very well-known personality in the migration journey of people from India to USA. So his son, David Thind, came to our, this is how we did. We invited him to our festival too, and he told all this great stories and shared pictures. For our viewers, Bhagat Singh Thind, I believe, came to US in 1912, or he came to study at Berkeley, and he also did PhD from there, and he joined US Army in World War I. And at that time, there was an exemption that if you serve in the Army, you can become a US citizen. So he tried that path to be a US citizen, but he was refused. And because if you go back into American history, that initially only the white people were allowed to become US citizens. And then later on, exemption was given to Afro-Americans after Civil War. But so his struggle was based on, one, him being a veteran of World War I. And secondly, there was a Japanese guy, I think it was Zaka, who was born in US, his parents were Japanese, and he was a very fair-looking guy. And he tried to become a US citizen saying, I'm a white guy. But the US Supreme Court at that time said, you may be a white-looking guy, but you are not a Caucasian. So then Bhagat Singh went all the way to US Supreme Court in 1923 and challenged that most of the people from North India, especially people from Punjab, are Caucasian by race. So US Supreme Court ruling said, yeah, you're Caucasian by race, by scientific terminology, but not by a common man's perception. So his plea for US citizenship was denied. So that guy is like, it's an amazing story that he was so much involved in the struggle for the citizenship rights in US. So we met his son. His son is still alive. He's kind of, I think, probably in his 90s now. I haven't talked to him lately. But there are so many other stories. We all know what story what Congressman Dilip's on, which is well documented. He also came like probably in 1910 or 12, same thing, to study at UC Berkeley. We all know a story about Kartar Singh Saraba, who was a freedom fighter. That's another piece of history which a lot of people don't know. India's freedom struggle from British rule was started in USA. There was a party formed called Gadar Party, which means Revolutionary Party. And they felt that the people from India are not getting good respect in USA because we come from a slave country. Maybe we need to liberate India and make India like America, like a United States of India. That was their dream. So many of those went back to fight against British rule. But they were heavily suppressed. Many of them were imprisoned. Some of them were hanged. So Kartar Singh Saraba was one of the students who came to study at Berkeley, UC Berkeley in California, but could not study, joined the revolutionary movement, went back to India, and he was hanged. He was not even 19-year-old when he was hanged by British. There's another story, which is everybody probably aware of. That's the story of Kamagata Maru. There was a ship. Canada was part of British Commonwealth. India was also ruled by British. Canada was also ruled by British. So British used to say that you can go anywhere and settle in the Commonwealth. So this group of people, which were led by Gurdit Singh, most of them were Sikhs, but they were people from all faiths on that ship. And they were not allowed to get off the ship when they came to Canada because there was a like little loophole in the law which only allowed people if they came by a continuous journey. So we also invited the gentleman who made this documentary called Continuous Journey. So that meant that you have to come from India by continuous journey. How you can come 100 years ago on a continuous journey? There were no airplanes, so people came by ships. The ships needed to stop to refuel or get food. So it used to take 3 to 6 months. So the ship was not allowed. And then that really made people here feel like we need to go back and fight for our freedom. Interestingly, the Sikhs were also fighting for British Indian Army. They were helping British in Europe against Hitler, or not Hitler at that time, it was not Hitler, but against the Germany and other countries. And the British was using Sikh soldiers, and at the same time, they were not allowing them to come to Canada. And so there's a lot of interesting stories which a lot of young people don't know. So right now, things are much better. I mean, now this country is our home, but it didn't happen overnight. It took years of struggle.
Since you have interviewed and collected so many stories, all the trailblazers that you just had a few names that you just listed to us, all the elders that you listed right now, what are and what have been your challenges in this project?
Challenges is that it's very hard to get information from families. Sometimes they don't see same way. Some of them are very helpful. They want to have their stories told, or some of them want to give up materials to you, but some feel they don't want to go back and relive those experiences they had, the difficult experiences. And some of those pioneers who came, they married into other communities and cultures, and their next generation don't have any passion, or they kind of very much lost any interest in their roots. And so And the other thing, as you mentioned, that some of our people who are not very educated, they didn't go and have a good picture, quality picture taken, or they didn't keep any diaries and didn't keep, or even some people had information. You ask, oh, I need some information. They will say, oh, I'll try to find it. You go back to them again. They're still trying to find it. So it took years for some people to dig out like useful information. I think this is about time. Otherwise, we're going to lose all that. So this is about time that we put it together. I think the Canadian community did a better job. They have done few books on the pioneers, but on US side, we haven't done a very detailed research so far. I think this project needs more efforts to preserve that important piece of history in our migration to USA.
Since you are already leading that charge, I think that history will be preserved and will be told to the future generations with the help of the community. And based on that, how helpful has been the community so far?
The community is very generous. Our community, once they buy into the idea, they are very generous. I will say financially, our community is so giving. We never had a problem raising funds or whenever we needed help. You go and ask the community, they've been very generous. But I think it's not just effort around our area. This effort needs to be expanded to other parts of California and also other parts of the country. Because if you look at our history is mainly concentrated in California and Southern California. El Centro area had huge Sikh community 100 years ago. And there's also a community in Washington state. And there are stories from Arizona, which we don't know very well, because a lot of Sikhs married Mexican American women, and some of them settled there. And at the same time, we had some immigration toward New York, which has not been very well documented either. So I think this needs ongoing effort, and I hope the more scholars or younger generation will continue to do efforts to dig more information out.
Uncle, you are leading the charge, and I hope you inspire many young people, the coming generation, and they'll get inspired after seeing your book, your movie, once this project is fulfilled and it's near fruition. If we talk about, Uncle, this particular year, 2020, it has been a very unique time in terms of the global pandemic. I know you are a very busy doctor, and since the pandemic came upon the society throughout the world, your time got more stringent. You had little time maybe for your own self, I believe. It was more dedicated towards the patient. So how did that help, or how did you manage between managing your time on the project towards your patients and the community and educating them on the pandemic and everything?
I think human beings are very adaptable, and initially when pandemic came, there was a lot of fear. We had no idea how to interact and how to react or deal with. Now I think we pretty much figured out our pathways, and we found new technologies like talking on Zoom and talking to people on social media. So despite it's been a very difficult year for most of people in health profession, but I will say the efforts are ongoing, and I think it probably even give people more time to, when you're sitting home, to dig out old information and rethink some ideas. So there is a good and bad side of everything. So that's my impressions.
But was this time during this year helpful towards your project, Uncle? In any way? In any way?
As I mentioned, that since people were not traveling or not doing other things, and many people were sitting at their homes, so it was easy to talk to them and find them. Actually, the people who are working and finalizing the book project, the more got done in last 6 months than we were able to do in the last few years. So that's the good side. But for me as a professionally, as a doctor, it did take a lot of my time to focus on patient care.
You have answered this question to me like in the previous segments, but I want to go in a little more detail. And so why do you think the South Asian history in United States or even California is so relevant today? And what do you hope that the youth and the particularly South Asian youth can take away from this project?
I mean, I think we sometimes forget the history and then it repeats again. I mean, there are forces of inclusiveness in society and there are forces of exclusion. So if you look back, we were one of the excluded groups. If you look back, when our pioneers came to this country, they could not become citizens. They could not buy properties. If you're not a citizen, you could not buy a property. And they could not marry because interracial marriages were perceived illegal at that time. So they could not vote. They had no voice. So if you look into the current situation, there are segments of society who feel like they're not being heard. So we need to understand that these things happen. If it happened to us, it happens to others too. So there has to be some understanding that when I tell, some people will say, oh, you know, they're more worried about economical aspects than the human rights or the equality aspects. When you remind them that your forefathers experienced these things in this country, that helps them bigger picture in their mind. So we didn't get all this successes in this country, all this economic flourishing we have seen now, all this opportunities we have now. It didn't happen overnight. There were a lot of sacrifices made. There were a lot of struggle. There were a lot of fights. There were a lot of legal fights. There were a lot of people have to sweat and work hard for minimum wages. It didn't happen overnight. It took more than a century to get where we are now. So we should have empathy for other immigrants and other people, same way we have for our own.
The culturally relevant content matters now more than ever. Do you feel the same, Uncle?
You know, I think you learn a lot from the pioneers and immigrants. You know, culture is a dynamic process. People have to adapt, and people will keep certain values they brought with them, and they will learn new values. So you can't completely give up your roots, and at the same time, you cannot remain same what you came. You have to adapt and adjust and keep the good values. You know, they're like good values of our Sikh working, we say naam shako, kirt karo, vand shako. Those are the core values, and they are very much fits into American values. And we believe in equality, which is the core value of American Constitution. So those values need to stay, but otherwise, you know, the next generation is going to mix with other culture. They're going to marry with another culture. They're going to be a lot of interfaith relations. They're going to be a cross-cultural relations. So those going to happen. That's, if you look at any immigrant community, they went through those processes. So it's the survival of the fittest, survival of the strong values. The values which are progressive, universal, they will stay. The values which are aggressive, exclusionary, which are not inclusive, they will gradually with time will not be able to sustain itself. So there is a lot of dichotomy between Sikh values and Punjabi culture. So, I mean, it's totally a separate topic, but I will say our community has brought certain values to America, and they're going to be becoming part of American values because its culture is a dynamic process. Things don't change overnight, but it's an ongoing process.
On the similar terms, do you have suggestions for the younger generation?
I think for a younger generation, I think it's important to know your roots. And nothing can stay strong during the changes of when you get a storm or a hurricane. They say if the tree has a strong roots, it will survive. So the roots are very important, but at the same time, we have an open mind to adapt and change accordingly. And this country gives us a lot of opportunity. Everything is not correct. Everything is not right. But we need to participate in the process to make changes, which is better for everybody. The gurus taught us sarvat da pala, you know. That principle applies everywhere. If we follow that path, that we're going to work for the betterment of society and betterment of every human being, that gives us a lot of power, or I will say a lot of encouragement. So young generation, just don't discard what your parents say. Your parents, listen to them. You may not agree with everything your parents or great grandparents it's important to listen because they have experience and they have the connection between two cultures and two subcontinents. So that is important to understand their perspective. You don't have to always agree with it, but it's important to listen. Some people just want to disown everything they brought with them. That's not a good idea. So it's going to be a mixed bag. You're going to keep some values which are strong and universal, and some values you're going to learn American ways to doing it. And even in India, even in Punjab, culture is dynamic. Things are not same they were at our time. And things were not same at our time, they were at our grandparents' time. So there's things going to change. Cultures change. Don't live in past, but learn from the past to make your future better.
Thank you so much. I hope, firstly, I personally eagerly waiting to see the book, the complete book, the movie on your project. So any timeline that you have when we can expect the book to be out?
Hopefully, we are hoping before middle of next year, we should have the book ready. Right now, we're in a just kind of final finishing of the book. The one thing I want to share, which a lot of people don't know, if it's okay with you, for me.
Yes, let's hear it.
A lot of people ask how we ended up here, how we ended up, why we came, what was the reason the Punjabis were here first, and how we ended up in America. So it's important to understand the history of Indian subcontinent. At that time, if you go back up to 1849, Punjab was an independent country itself. Maharaja Ranjit Singh ruled till 1839. After his death, things in Punjab started falling apart. So there was a big Anglo-Sikh war in 1849, about 170 years ago. So in 1849, British took the Punjab control, but it was like almost more than 100 years after the rest of the India was taken by British. Even British took parts of India maybe 200 years before Punjab. So British initially tried to, it was not a British at that time, it was the East India Company, which was an English company. So they tried to suppress the Sikhs with very heavy hand. But they were very smart. They learned within few years that it was not a good idea fighting with the Sikhs. So what they thought that why not we recruit all the young Sikh men in the English army and put them away from Punjab. It will do two things. One thing, it will reduce the risk of rebellion in Punjab. And secondly, it will give the employment to the Sikh men. And thirdly, use them for other purposes. They use them more like mercenaries. They brought a lot of Sikh men to Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Indochina. So when these soldiers started retiring, they started exploring more. They came more toward the western part of the Pacific part of USA. So some of these, if you really read the history carefully, the pioneers were mainly the soldiers or the policemen who had served in British or English Indian Army at that time. So those were the first people who landed here. Same thing in Canada. It was a Sikh regiment which went to Queen Victoria's 25th coronation celebrations in 1897, and they came on a ship to Vancouver, and then they took a train and went to the East Coast, and then they went to England. So they were the first one to see all the vast lands in Canada at that time. So that interaction with the British or English rule played a big role in the migration of our pioneers. And then some of those soldiers went back to India and told, hey, there's a lot of land, there's a lot of work opportunities. So this is how our people started trickling. There's a story that our people worked on building highways, railway lines. That is something we need to research more and find those names and those pictures if we can find.
Thank you, Uncle. You have all of my support and the community's support as well, like you said, for the completion of the movie and the book. And Uncle, we really look forward for it. I really thank your time for today.
Well, thank you, Asjit, and thanks to Sikh Lands. Thank you very much.